I don't know about you, but I have a real problem deferring to an authority figure. I'm just not built to defer to authorities. But there is a really interesting question about when is it actually appropriate, when should I defer to an authority? So I'm going to give you two kinds of cases. Here's the first kind of case. It's thinking about when someone has authority over what you should do. So take the following case. Your boss tells you that the report is due on Friday and you got to get it done by Friday. That's not a situation in which you think, yeah, thanks, boss, for your input, but I think I'm going to go with Tuesday. It's due on Tuesday. That's not right. That's not how it works. The boss has a certain kind of authority to which you ought to defer, at least in this kind of case. And so they preempt, to use a sort of technical term that philosophers use, they preempt your own judgment about what you should do. There's other kinds of cases where people tell you something to do, but you don't defer to them automatically. You take it into consideration. So for instance, your friend says, oh, you should really go to this restaurant. And you don't say something like, oh, I was going to go to the other restaurant, but because my friend said I should go to that one, I hereby defer because they were my sort of restaurant boss. That's not how it works. What you do instead is you take it into consideration. You think, okay, Mark wants me to go to this restaurant. That's his advice. Go to that one. I don't really want to do that, though. I think I want to do this other one. And so you take it into consideration, but you don't automatically defer. So again, you defer to your boss in terms of what to do, but you don't defer to your friend in terms of where to go for the restaurant, generally speaking. That's the case of action. But now I want you to think for a second about when do you defer to other people when it comes to what you believe? In some cases, you clearly defer to others because of their expertise, and more than that, they know so much more than you. You're not a co-expert with them. They are just way more knowledgeable. So for instance, you might go to a doctor and the doctor says, here's the diagnosis and here's the test that I performed and here are the numbers, and you have cancer or whatever it is. You've got shingles. I don't really know what shingles are, by the way. What shingles is? Anyway, you defer to them because you know that they know more than you. And so you don't say, I'm going to figure it out myself. What you do is you believe what they tell you ought to believe because they are, and here's the fancy term, epistemic authorities. Epistemic has to do with what you know, how you know it, whether you're justified in believing it, stuff like that. So they are your epistemic authorities in the way that your boss is your action authority in a certain context at work. In other cases, though, people tell us what to believe, and we don't view them as epistemic authorities. That is to say, we don't just say, Mark told me to believe that, and so now I do. Instead, once again, like with the restaurant, we take it into consideration. Think about the testimony that you hear at a court trial or something along those lines. You don't just take the person's word for it and say, they said the butler did it, so now I believe the butler did it. You take their judgment, their reasoning into consideration in trying to form your own beliefs. So with the boss, what to do, you defer to the boss on what to do. You don't defer to your friend on what to do. You take it into consideration. When it comes to what to believe, as opposed to what to do, when it comes to what to believe, in some cases you defer to the authority, the person who knows a bunch. And in some cases, you don't defer to them, but once again, you take their view into consideration in figuring out what you think that you should believe. Now, why am I talking about all of this? Because we've reached this really interesting point at which AI provides us with advice, with recommendations. It engages in some kind of, or it seems to be anyway, a line of reasoning for why it comes to that recommendation that it does. And in some domains, it looks to be, and if it's not now, arguably will be, an epistemic authority. It'll be a thing that knows more than we do. For instance, it knows all the medical stuff. And so does it know more about medicine than me? Let's put to the side questions about whether they know anything at all because they're not knowledge machines. Put that to the side. Lots of other episodes about that. But it looks like there are cases in which they can output information where plausibly they're the epistemic authority, and so plausibly you should defer to them. Or should you not? How should we regard AI in those cases in which it actually is an epistemic authority? This is the question, this is the issue that I addressed with my guest today. His name is Benjamin Lange. He's a research assistant professor in the ethics of AI and machine learning at the Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich, that's in Germany. And we talk about whether, if AI is in certain contexts an epistemic authority, should we actually defer to it, or should we not defer to it? So we should take its advice into consideration. Or put slightly differently, are there situations in which we should defer to the AI and believe what it, as it were, tells us to believe? Or are there cases in which should we ever do that? And if so, when? Or should we never do that kind of thing? Okay, that's the setup for this conversation. As you can see, it's a little bit complicated. In my view, it's utterly fascinating. And it's really important because it raises a different way in which we might think that humans need to be involved in the operations of AI. You may have heard the phrase, a human in the loop. We want a human in the loop to avoid certain kinds of ethical problems. This is a way of saying we might need a human in the loop to avoid certain belief-related problems, whether we are being responsible belief holders, believers, that sort of thing. So I think it's super interesting, and it's a different take on how you think about how people ought to interact with AI. Okay, that's what this episode is about. A few things today, one sort of bigger announcement at the end. First, if you're one of the many people who are listening to this podcast on a mobile browser, please head over to Apple or Spotify or whatever your preferred podcast platform is and go subscribe so that you get future episodes. If you like this podcast called Ethical Machines, you might also like my book called Ethical Machines. You can find that on Amazon and other places. There's also my Substack, where I do educational pieces and also op-eds. That's at reedblackman.substack.com. And you can email me at em@reedblackman.com. Okay, now for the sort of announcement-y kind of thing. I do a lot of speaking. Most of it is behind closed doors, but I am doing a talk at a conference called Compliance in the Age of AI. It's on June 12th to 13th in San Francisco, California, so it's coming up pretty soon. There's other great speakers there. There's Dan Golden. He is a former administrator of NASA. He was there for over 30 years. An administrator of NASA is basically the CEO of NASA, so pretty big, important position. And there's also going to be a panel on responsible AI with representatives from OpenAI, IBM, and Salesforce. So I think there's going to be lots of good stuff there. Please come sign up, and you can come harass me. If you're interested in learning more about it, you could go to, here's the URL. Ready? Are you ready? Ready? opalgroup.net, so opalgroup.net/ethical machines. So go there and it'll show you all the information you want about the conference. And there's a discount code for 50% off. The discount code is REID, that's me, REID 50 for 50% off. Again, opalgroup.net/ethical machines is the website, and the discount code is REID 50. Okay, I hope to see you there. And now let's go talk to Benjamin. So Ben, there are these things that philosophers call epistemic authorities. So these are the kinds of, usually people, that they know a bunch of stuff. They know more, let's say, than you and I. And what makes them epistemic authorities is that they know. So epistemic having to do with they know more stuff. And it seems like the thing that we ought to do when faced with epistemic authorities is we should defer to them. After all, they know more than you or I. I defer to physicists about matters of physics because they know more than I do. They're the epistemic authorities in physics. My doctor is my epistemic authority in the realm of medicine, and so I tend to defer to my doctor. I might ask some questions, but I tend to defer to my doctor's judgment more than mine because they know so much more than I do. And I guess that when I think about AI then, I want to, in some cases anyway, if AI reaches a certain bar, it seems like, just like we defer to the physicists and the doctors, et cetera, we should defer to AI when it showcases that it has superior knowledge. It is an epistemic authority. And I take it that you want to push against that whole view. Do I have that right?
I think that's correct, exactly. I think it's very tempting to go via an accuracy account that says, so if it gets it more accurate most of the time, we should just defer to it blindly. But I think there's a bunch of buts and ifs attached to that. And the question is, even if AI is extremely reliable and more reliable than expert human authorities, I think there's problems with the view that we should therefore always defer to it. And that kind of puts the bar quite high for current applications of AI systems, actually.
Yeah, so we're putting to the side, most listeners are going to think, oh, but AI is not that smart. It hallucinates. It makes mistakes all the time. Blah, blah. I think we're just putting that to the side and saying, look, let's just suppose we've got an AI that's better. And if you don't take these sort of analog to an epistemic authority, like a driving authority, you might think if the cars are so much better at driving than we are at some point, then we should let the cars drive instead of the humans drive, something along those lines. It's safer. They're better drivers, blah, 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 blah. And let's put the sort of concerns that AI is not up to snuff yet to the side. let's assume for the sake of argument that in all domains or in some subset of domains, it's just smarter than us in the sense that it's more accurate, it gives more truthful outputs than humans do. So in that case, you think, let's not necessarily defer to the AI, even though we acknowledge that it's our epistemic authority.
Yeah, so I think...
Or rather, our epistemic superior.
Yeah, so I think I'm with you on the point that let's suppose there's some systems which in some particular domain are working very well. I think medicine is a good example, even though there's certain principles about autonomy and informed consent, extra requirements that apply, but suppose cancer detection or kind of melanoma detection works very well, better than doctors. The doctors defer to it. Now, the question then becomes, could this kind of artificial system be considered an epistemic authority? So on the first point then is, okay, so what's an authority? There's someone we turn to just to defer in our judgment. It doesn't have to actually be an expert. So you and I can be both authorities or not authorities for one another, but it doesn't mean we're an expert. When we're talking about an expert, it's usually a kind of absolute threshold of knowledge. An authority is just someone who is better than you in some domain. I don't know, you and I are both philosophy professors, but it might be that even though we're both expert, we're not authorities for one another, because relative to one another actually was much about Kant than I do. And then you can push back and say, is it really plausible, first of all, that that kind of AI system can be an epistemic authority? But I actually think there's good reasons to make this kind of case.
So to be clear then, you're okay with the claim that it could be an expert? But at least not, so it could be a medical expert, like at diagnosing cancer or diagnosing illness across a range of symptoms. Yeah, but it might not be an authority.
I think that's actually, I'm neutral on that question. So I think authority, being an authority in epistemic and an expert don't go hand in hand. The one is not necessary for the other. So I'm just concerned with, could it be an authority? Setting aside the issue of, okay, so what is actually an expert? Like it's just something, some kind of system that reliably gets it right and we want to turn to it. And I think there's good reasons to think that might is plausible because they do provide highly specialized information, explanation, and reliable advice. If you think about the kind of outputs of a cancer detection algorithm, they're certainly epistemically superior. And there's also this kind of interesting asymmetry because they can absorb such large amounts of data that this mirrors the expert-layman divide that we usually see between authorities, right? So the divide between even a cancer detection algorithm and a doctor or layman might be the same as a doctor and their patient in a particular case. And so I think it actually is quite plausible that the first step of the idea that there could be things such as artificial epistemic authorities.
Yeah, why wouldn't we defer to them? If you've got, I like to give this sort of toy example of, you bring your child to a doctor, the doctor is 75% accurate at diagnosing cancer. You've got this AI that's 95% accurate at diagnosing cancer. The two diverge in opinion, so to speak. The AI says yes, cancer. Doctor says no, cancer. Doctor's doesn't really understand why the AI is coming up with a positive here, but we do know that it's 95% accurate compared to the 75% accurate. Why wouldn't we? What's the argument for not deferring to the AI? Because I feel, oh my God, my child's life is on the line. Yep. Surely I should just go with the more accurate thing. Let's go with the AI.
I think you're right. That might seem like the rational thing to do. And it's helpful here to frame the extreme, right? Philosophers sometimes like to consistently come up with the one extreme position and see what the implications of this would be. And I think the way social epistemologies think about this is, well, if you're so much more accurate, then we should probably just always replace whatever you're giving me as an output or guidance with whatever I'm believing. So this is, I always go with the doctor's judgment. And that would be the AI position, the kind of AI preemptionism. And that might seem like, for the reasons you're giving, a very plausible position, because if the track record really shows that you always get it right, it would be irrational to try and think it through for myself. So if the system always gets it right compared to the doctor, you might think even the doctor thinking it through for themselves might just be making an error. They might be reducing accuracy. So especially if you care about accuracy, you might think it seems like a plausible position. But then there's buts. Preemptionism has problems. And I think in the case of AI, they actually are particularly acute. This kind of position to always defer to AI, some inherent issues.
So you use this term preemptionism, and you also use this other word that was less jargony, which is replace. You replace your own judgment with the AI's judgment. Is preemptionism the view that you should treat sort of something that is authoritative relative to you, let's say is more accurate relative to you? You should, being a preemptionist means that you ought to, is the position that you ought to replace your own judgment with its judgment, or if it's a person, their
judgment. You could phrase it like this. Yeah, philosophers can get more kind of persnickety and precise about, is it beliefs, is it outputs, is it beliefs? I think we can set this aside. It's just whatever it says, positive, negative, classified, non-classified, you should just take that and use it. Whatever you're thinking, if you're thinking anything at all. Exactly, that's the position.
And what's the alternative to preemptionism? What's the other way we could regard its outputs or beliefs or whatever you want to call it, that such that even though we acknowledge that it's typically better than us at this thing, nonetheless, we shouldn't replace the judgment. What else should we do?
Well, what's usually framed...
Defy?
Yeah, that's one good term. That might be a good new position. What's usually framed against this preemptionist idea to epistemic authority as difference is a total evidence account. So total evidence means whatever the AI says should count quite strongly, but it should be with certain conditions, or it should be one piece that weighs quite heavily, but it shouldn't just outright overrule everything that we might be thinking, even if I don't think much. And I think there's good reasons for this position, especially in the case of AI.
So let me see if I can make this concrete. I think I understand the view. It's funny in a way. So it's something like, okay, what evidence is there that I have cancer, or something along those lines? This test said yes. This test said no. This other test said yes, or whatever. Or this image seems to indicate it, that it's probable, whatever. And here's one more piece of evidence that I have. The AI thinks that I have cancer. And so I'm supposed to see the sort of AI's judgment as a piece of evidence alongside all the other pieces of evidence, as opposed to the AI, as it were, above all the evidence and being itself the evidence weigher, and then you're deferring to this superior evidence
Exactly,
weigher.
because it's not...
Is that the view?
That's the view, exactly.
And what's the appeal of it? I see the appeal of it. And I get this shows up in epistemology more generally, what you've rightly referred to as social epistemology, when experts disagree with each other.
Expert disagreement,
So experts disagree. Philosophers notoriously disagree about everything. Philosophers disagree with themselves. Like a given philosopher will disagree with himself, as we know. And so in light of all that disagreement, should you just defer to the other expert? No, they're not. You should defer. Their judgment shouldn't replace yours, since you're both experts. And you should take the fact that they disagree with you as some degree of evidence that maybe you're wrong. Let's say if you disagree with me on some philosophical issue, I don't just defer to Ben, to you, because you're super smart. It's just, one piece of evidence for the fact that I'm wrong is that Ben thinks I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Is that right?
That's one way to think of it. Another way is to just see that you're aggregating evidence. So there's lots of different pieces, and it might be that the AI system's piece counts or is weightier. But nonetheless, if there's disagreement, if certain conditions don't obtain, there's conflicting evidence, there's some domain mismatch, perhaps the AI isn't trained on this particular domain, you should not just outright kind of give ultimate weight to whatever the output of the AI system is.
Yeah. So maybe a lot of this depends, though, on how much better it is than we are. Same with a person. It depends on how much better the person is. So let's put AI to the second, to the side. It's just me and the doctor, or me and the physicist, or whatever. Let's say I'm talking to some physicist, and they just know so much more than I do about, let's go with quantum physics. I know a little bit.
It's plausible, yeah.
I know a little bit. It's very plausible. Or you can even take a philosopher of physics like Tim Maudlin, who's super smart and knows way more about physics than I do. I think that it would be weird of me. When I say weird, I mean something like irrational, to put it the way that philosophers like to put it. For me to be like, Tim, who's an expert on philosophy of physics and physics more generally, or whatever. I don't know any. Do you know any physicists around? I don't know any quantum physicists around. I don't know their names. Anyway, it would be weird for me to say, I'm inclined to think, I don't know, the sun revolves around the Earth. And yeah, sure, brilliant physicist or whatever says, no, actually the Earth goes around the sun. But I'm like, yeah, but that person's saying that it's just one piece of evidence. It's just one. I'm not going to defer just because he's a physicist. I'm not going to defer to him. I'll take it into account. Thank you for your input. That seems crazy, right? At least from the outside, that looks like a crazy thing.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if it's you, and I'm just going to stipulate that you don't know much about quantum physics, or at least not much more than me, then the fact that you say it, I could see that as counting as some evidence, as another piece of evidence, and it not being irrational to defer to you. So does it really just boil down to how much better is the person or knowledgeable or whatever it is than we are?
Yeah, I think
that makes it rational to defer or not?
That's one way to look at it. So I think we can argue about the different conditions that might obtain. I think your point raises an interesting objection that's usually then raised against the kind of preemptionist camp, which is the idea that even if you get it right all the time, so think about the physicist case, they're not infallible or they're in any way omniscient.
Sure.
So the question is, have they really considered all of the reasons? They might consider most, very probable they've considered most, but it doesn't seem obviously true that they will have considered everything. But if you're a preemptionist, you would just go with it and say, oh, it's so much more likely. But the worry then here becomes that actually this can lead to epistemic losses as opposed to gains. Because unless you assume that they really considered all of the reasons, there might actually be some mistakes that are being made. This is more plausible perhaps even in the human case than in the AI case.
Mm-hmm. It sounds weird to me, though, this distinction between
Preemptionism and...
Preemptionism, thank you.
It's quite a mouthful.
Yeah,
philosophers have these weird like
really
preemptionism, whatever. Believe always what the AI says for you, or believe always what the authority says for you.
They should call it deferentialism, seems would be better. Anyway, so there's preemptionism on the one side, and then there's, what is it? Evidentialism on the other?
Yeah, there's total evidence. I don't know. I didn't make up the terms. I just want to stay consistent with what the literature has decided to give the evidence views.
It feels like we need another ism. There should be two isms combating each other. Anyway, putting that to the side, it seems like, why do we have to choose one or the other? Why can't we just say, listen, in some cases, you should just definitely defer to the person. These flat earthers should probably just defer to every other physicist on the planet. And in some cases, you shouldn't defer because they're not sufficiently authoritative, not sufficiently... So why do we need to choose? I guess is my question. Why can't we just say some cases it's appropriate to defer, in some cases it's not? And then we just go on a case-by-case basis.
I think the view you're actually outlining would be a total evidence account. As soon as you say we shouldn't always just blindly go with the putative authority, but we should make it dependent on certain contextual factors, you're probably already in the camp of a total evidence view. So in the case of the AI view I'm exploring, it could be that some evidence might suggest that there's certain errors in the reasoning or in the data, that there's conflicting authority, or there's some evidence that hasn't been considered. All of these are contextual factors where you might say, objectively speaking, keeping in mind there's always the kind of case, okay, so the flat earther in their epistemic world, what do they have access to and what could we objectively assess? We could just say they haven't considered all the facts. For them, there's a separate question, of course, like what should we do given our ignorance about many things and so on, which is what we're probably not so much concerned with here. But the kind of position you're outlining would then already be a kind of total evidence view, I'd say.
Okay. I could definitely get into the weeds of that, but I'm going to spare our audience that. But I guess at the end of the day, what you're saying is, it's something like, I think we have a tendency for it to be the case that once AI reaches a certain level, we want to regard it as like a kind of oracle. Like it's the thing that we go to that knows, and we just defer to it. And once we get to, let's talk in the terms that Silicon Valley talks in, once we get to AGI, or once we get to ASI, artificial superintelligence, what we should be doing is deferring to the almighty AI. And I take it that your point is something like, even if we get an artificial general intelligence, or even if we get an artificial superintelligence, smarter than us, nonetheless, we still shouldn't just think, let's just defer now to the smarter thing here. Because that would be, I take it you think, that would be itself an irrational thing to do.
Yes, I think that if we were to get to these kinds of systems, they would have to be designed in a way to meet certain defeater and re-evaluation conditions by design, so we can rest assured that they would fall into what you would call a total evidence account. So they could be evaluated possibly about how reliable they've been, whether what kind of evidence they've considered, if they've taken conflicting judgments into account, and only then we would approximate some position where we would just be in a position to say, okay, we just blindly defer to the system for a particular question.
I'm getting a little bit thrown off by the blindly stuff, because it's not blind deference. It's deference based on the fact that it's gone through all this testing and analysis, and then we conclude, just like with a person, wow, that physicist, they really know their shit. Yep. They really got it.
They have credentials, they have a certificate, they have like qualifiers that makes them an authority, yes.
And maybe you see other experts in the field who say, yeah, that person's super smart. So that's further evidence. And so at some point when I defer to that super smart physicist, it's not a blind deference. It's a deference based on the fact that there's all this evidence that deferral is appropriate, that his judgment or her judgment should replace mine because my judgment is naive relative to theirs, which is not to say that they're infallible. It's just to say that if you got to believe something, of course, suspension of belief is an option, but if you got to believe something, then don't believe your own rationale over theirs because you're naive and they're clearly super smart and credentialed and blah, 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 blah. This is just me saying this. Nobody thinks you should blindly defer to an expert or a person or an authority. They're epistemic authorities for certain reasons. And then I just want to say the same thing about the AI. If we run the AI through 1 billion tests, blah, 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 we're trying to see if it's looking at different sources, all the things that you said. And I find that, it's really in control of, let's say, the medical literature in a way that no doctor is or even possibly could be, no person could be, because it's too much information. Then when I defer to the AI, that is not blind. It is well-reasoned replacement of my judgment with its judgment.
That's one way to put it. Yeah, that's one way to put it.
But then, okay, so then it seems, look, does anyone think that we should blindly defer to AI without having a sense of how good it is at what it does? I don't think so.
No.
So it's precisely because it's so good at what it is. So now I'm losing sight of the distinction, because if me doing all that assessing of the AI or of the physicist or whatever, and then replacing my own judgment with theirs is compatible with, what is it, total evidence theory, then yeah, what's the appeal of the other view of preemptionism?
Well, the other view, I think, is that the purported advantage that it's supposed to give you is that you just always get a more consistent, reliable way to actually arrive at true beliefs. So the first question is, who can be an epistemic authority? AI system might be one. Okay, suppose we've granted this. Then the question becomes, how ought we to respond to an epistemic authority? Ought we to always, in every case, hence the kind of blindly, are we always then consistently in every matter in their domain of expertise deferring to them? Or is there an issue here that even if they're an epistemic authority, the right rational response epistemically isn't to always defer to them, but it's to have footnotes attached about what conditions need to be met. And that's where the debate then occurs, about the consistent deferral in the domain, or the consistent deferral provided there's other conditions in place, such as there's no conflicting judgments, you have proof that whatever the AI system has been trained, and so on. I hope that's helpful. That's the kind of way of framing the disagreement.
Yeah, so something like this, you got to reach a certain bar.
Exactly.
A certain level to be an epistemic authority.
Yeah.
Right? And then you get like a gold star. Ta-da, you're an epistemic authority, whether it's a physicist or whether it's a philosopher or whether it's an AI, a medical diagnosing AI. Once you've reached a certain level of proficiency, then you get the gold star of, you're an epistemic authority, congratulations. And then the question becomes, how should we treat epistemic authorities? And to put it slightly differently, how is it rational to treat epistemic authorities? Does that gold star give them something like, that means you should always defer to an epistemic authority? Or instead, do you think, yes, they're epistemic authorities, and that's important, but it's not important in the sense that now it means that their judgment rationally should replace your own. It just means that their judgment should be taken as strong evidence for review.
Yeah, that's the framing.
So in the context of AI, one thing that people talk about is having a human in the loop. A human in the loop is supposed to be person that comes between the outputs of an AI and some ultimate action or impact or something like that. That we don't want it to go from an AI making a quote unquote decision to, let's say, a certain course of treatment being prescribed to a patient, as an example. That we always want a human in the loop. And so you put a human, and so this is really the claim that you shouldn't automatically defer to things that are legit epistemic authorities, is, in the context of AI, an argument for the claim that you should always have a human in the loop.
That's exactly right.
That right.
That's exactly right. I think what this kind of position gives you, so if you think about this matter in terms of preemptionism, total evidence views, and if you think total evidence views are the kind of way to go, which I think is true, then you found a new epistemic argument for the necessity of human-in-the-loop functions. And I think that's interesting and cool, because most of the discussion oftentimes comes from moral philosophy. I'm a moral philosopher myself, so I'm like, humans need to be involved because there's certain values we need to uphold, moral ones, control, etc. But actually, epistemically, you can now argue total evidence-type views applied to AI give you necessarily a human-in-the-loop type component or a human control component. So these kinds of views entail that there should be meaningful human control in these kinds of decision scenarios. And I think that's an interesting upshot because it reinforces the human-in-the-loop, meaningful human control case.
Okay, let me try to spell something out and see if, I don't know if I have a sort of, whatever, it's a question. I hear you about human-in-the-loop is often taken to be an ethical requirement. As I understand it, you want a human-in-the-loop as a kind of strategy, an ethical strategy to avoid ethically bad things from happening. Oh, we need humanity in the equation. A person needs to be there with human values. You put human values, that talk annoys me, but put that to the side. We need someone with human value as opposed to aardvark values. What are we talking about here? Anyway, so we have human values, and to make sure that the AI doesn't act in a way that's not aligned with our human values, we put a human in the loop. And so it's a strategy for ethical risk mitigation, something along those lines. That's one way, yeah. And I take it that the sort of force of this argument is that you're more likely to hit on ethically acceptable outcomes with a human in the loop than without. Something like that. Okay. If that's right, then not the epistemic analog for an epistemic argument for human in the loop, as contrasted with an ethical argument for human in the loop, would be something like, I would think anyway, you're more likely to hit on true beliefs by having a human in the loop.
Yeah. So it's epistemically more responsible, which I think then dovetails with a kind of ethical analog. Essentially, you're starting to formulate a kind of epistemic analog, an argument that dovetails with the kind of ethical argument.
Okay. Like there's two ways of getting to this epistemic human in the loop, the epistemic argument for human in the loop that we're thinking about right now. And I'm not sure how they relate to each other exactly. If one reduces to the other, if one follows from the other, or if they're two separate things altogether. Yeah. There's one argument that goes like this. A human in the loop, when you're trying to figure out what to believe, what's true, having a human in the loop will make you more likely to come to true beliefs. That's one kind, and that would be one epistemic argument for having a human in the loop. There's another one. So that first one is a bit consequentialist in some sense. It's going to get you more true beliefs. It's going to increase true beliefs. The alternative, which is really the one that I think that you were driving at, is like a principled argument. If the other one is consequentialist, this one is a deontological argument for having for an epistemic argument for a human loop. It's something like, it's contrary to rationality to automatically defer even to an epistemic authority, independently of consequences of doing such a thing. It's just something here is irrational about that. And so we ought to have a human in the loop because it would be irrational not to. And is that right? Unless, small caveat here, unless the reason that it would be irrational to automatically defer to the epistemic authority is that it will get you the true beliefs less often.
Yeah, so I think I'm more closely aligned with the second formulation that you've given. So there is a claim about what would be epistemically responsible and irresponsible. And the total evidence accounts entail that you will need a human involved necessarily to check for certain ifs and buts as part of actually weighing the kind of judgment. And that's the argument for meaningful human control. And I think that's more a claim about what's necessarily required to do something that's rational in this case in deferring your view about a subject matter and not so much concerned with just the outcomes, as it were, and saying like this is going to promote more truth or something. Just as we're thinking through this, I'm unsure you might be able, like perhaps both of these could exist, like both of these kinds of arguments, but I feel more strongly identified with the second claim that you formulated.
Okay, great. So now I guess what I want to know is what would make it irresponsible of me to automatically defer to an epistemic authority, be it an AI or a non-AI?
Yeah, preemptionism,
also known as a person.
Exactly. Suppose there's some person such that they're an epistemic authority. The problem is preemptionism there's lots of issues with it. As compelling as it might seem, there's lots of issues with it. I can go through a bunch, but I think one interesting one, for example, that has been raised by some people is the fact that it requires people to unhinge their own what's called epistemic basis and replace them with their authorities' beliefs. That kind of means like whatever you have in your head that you think leads to the truth needs to be replaced with whatever the expert is saying, like what you were saying as the philosophy professor or the physician, the doctor. And it seems that in the case of AI, I think this can even be worse, because if you think about the way most systems which are not having reasoning capabilities are giving their output, so think about like cancer, not cancer, positive, negative, at the output level. So if AI preemptionism were true, you would actually not just be unhinging or epistemic basis, but you would be removing them for just an output. So you actually lose your epistemic base. It's severed in some way, and you have this kind of dependence without any kind of understanding whatsoever. So you're not even replacing the reasoning chain. And I think that's a very strong principled argument against, say, the preemptionist kind of account. So that applies on the one end to the human expert. Some people think that's already a reason in the human case to reject preemptionism. Yeah. And I'm trying to then think through, okay, so how would it play out in the AI case? And I think this objection is actually amplified.
I understand that. Okay, I've got a bunch of reasons for thinking that, whatever, the earth is flat, or reasons for whatever.
I cannot see past the horizon, therefore the earth is flat. Or so you have some kind of belief and reason, some fact about the world from that.
And if I were to defer to an epistemic authority, I have to sever myself from my reasoning.
Exactly, because it gets screened off or replaced, whatever the authority says. Actually, the Earth is round because whatever science has shown that if you fly into space, whatever they give you.
And I guess I want to say, so why is it irresponsible of me to sever myself from my reasoning? I could see an ethical argument for thinking that there's something like morally objectionable, lacking in integrity, a defiling of the self, which is, I don't know, morally problematic or ethically problematic or not conducive to flourishing or something, blah, blah, blah. So I could see an ethical argument for why you shouldn't divorce yourself from such things. I'm not sure that I understand yet what's epistemically irresponsible.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point to ask. And I think you're nicely sketching the kind of criticism to the criticism. It's often a back and forth in philosophy for the listeners, like what the objection to the objection. I suppose here someone would say, it's not just about replacing and getting to the truth, but it's also about understanding. Like there's certain virtues, epistemic ones. And what we want to promote when the doctor explains to you their diagnosis, you don't just accept their diagnosis, but you're gaining some virtuous thing, you're gaining understanding, because in some form or another, it's going to enhance your knowledge about how exactly whatever your internal organs are working such that you are ill at the moment. And so there is some kind of virtuous epistemic process occurring. Now, the question is, the critic says, preemptionism can't give you that, because they always say, well, you want the truth, here's my belief, whatever my understanding needs to have occur to it in order for me to progress as a kind of knower is being put to the side. And those people think that's objectionable.
I'm going to put it slightly differently, and you tell me if this is not an okay way of capturing it. If I'm missing something, if I'm misrepresenting something. To take a step back, there's a variety of ways that I could be, I don't know, like a good father. I tell my kids I love them. I encourage them and their academic endeavors, which is to say learning how to read and write. I take them to various activities, and they have, whatever, play dates, they meet up with their friends, whatever. I do the things and so there's something it is to be a good father that's based on doing a whole suite of activities, a whole bunch of things. And then you say, there's another weird thing that I am. There's lots of things. I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a philosopher, whatever. I hate saying I'm a philosopher, whatever. And you can be good or bad at those kinds of things. And there are some things that sort of would make me, if I were a good father, I'm not, I'm terrible, but if I were a good father, I'd probably be patient with my children and interested in deliberating about what would be best for them and subordinating some of my own interests to their interests, blah, blah. So that's kinds of the things that make me a good father, the virtues of a good father. And this other thing that I am, aside from those other things, and that you are, and that most everyone is what people might call, what philosophers call, an epistemic agent. Like you're a thing that creates beliefs. And to be a good belief haver, to be a good knowledge former or belief former, is to have certain kinds of things about me that make me a good belief haver. And then it's going to be something like, I'm the kind of person that keeps looking for the evidence, who wants to understand the connections, who does understand the connections, who doesn't just seek out evidence that confirms what I already believe, but I seek out contrary. This is like what makes us good, responsible believers. Just like there's certain things that make me a good, responsible father. And the case in which you just defer to an epistemic authority, so the objection goes that I think you articulated, is one according to which you fail to manifest the virtues of a good belief haver.
Exactly. And I think there's quite a pull to this kind of argument. You put it very nicely. We as philosophy scholars, professors, we do this all the time. We want our students to learn to think and understand why an argument might be not sound or invalid. It's not just about, is it valid or invalid? And then, okay, he told me it's invalid, therefore I go with that. And now I've learned this. It's about, you need to understand the rule, the underlying process, and that there's some value to this epistemic value. It's virtuous, an epistemic virtue to have this kind of understanding. And the objection then goes, if you're so concerned just with arriving at the truth reliably, like preemptionism forces us, then you're losing that virtue, and that's problematic, and therefore we shouldn't just endorse the preemptionist account.
Yeah, it's problematic from an epistemic perspective, not just a sort of an ethical perspective.
Yeah.
Okay. That all seems plausible to me. Obviously I don't have a settled view on this. But if you do, I'll just defer to yours.
I'm not sure I'm an authority for you. It's like we both. We both might be experts, but we might not be authorities for one another. So
okay, I withdraw my deferral. Although, if I withdraw my deferral in response to your saying that I should withdraw my deferral, am I inappropriately deferring?
There's probably some infinite regress argument in there as well. Maybe
exactly.
There's your new paper.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I want to ask one. I don't know if this is a final question, but maybe. I guess I want to ask, where does this leave us? Let's suppose that this argument is correct, that there's something epistemically irrational about automatically deferring to an epistemic authority, whether it's a person or whether it's an AI. That sort of distinction I don't think makes much of a difference if you can show that, because I take it that it gets the gold star of epistemic authority once it's reached a certain level of proficiency, and
seems intuitively
whether it reaches that level of proficiency. Yeah. So where does that leave us? Does that say something about how individual people should use or not use AI? Does it say something about how developers should develop or not develop AI? Does it say something about how we should be thinking about testing AI? What should different people in the AI ecosystem, to put it broadly, what should they walk away with if we grant the view that we shouldn't automatically defer to epistemic authorities?
I think this has quite serious implications for how we should, from the perspective of epistemic rationality, currently engage with AI systems, because only a few current AI systems will easily satisfy the requirements to actually then qualify appropriately as artificial epistemic authorities. So we would have to, at minimum, have means to demonstrate sustained accuracy in their domain, mechanisms for reliability checks, and also afford users means to detect when that's something that I argue for, certain defeater conditions actually arise for whatever domain they're being applied to. And that's very problematic with current AI architectures because they're oftentimes not reasoning based, right? And so especially if you think about black box models. So I think this puts the bar quite high and actually means that only a handful of current systems in use will meet that kind of bar. Perhaps the ones that are used, say, in medicine and medical imaging, very narrow domains. Yeah. So the general, I ask ChatGPT about some matter. LLMs have their own problems, but the kind of general of deferring to AI systems because it seems so compelling on the surface, I think is highly problematic if we look at what social epistemology has to say.
So so the bar that you're talking about is the epistemic authority bar. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
That it has to reach? Mm-hmm. So let's take the case, though. I agree that there's many cases in which the AI is not going to reach that bar of epistemic authority. But in those cases in which it does, let's say LLMs get more and more proficient. People in Silicon Valley talk about PhD level. I'm not really sure what that exactly means.
For $20,000, by the way. I wonder if they actually try to quantify the value of a PhD student with that pricing, which would be funny.
I mean, you can definitely a philosophy PhD for less than $20,000 a month, like a full-time human being.
Maybe you should ask what kind of subject matter is it? Is it like physics? What's the subject matter for the agent?
Yeah,
anyway,
exactly.
That's a different podcast episode.
And is it like a smart PhD or a dumb PhD?
An Ivy League or non-Ivy League? What are we talking here?
Yeah. Did they get the PhD because the school was just trying to get them out of the program already? Just get them out? Or so they could free up funding for someone who's better? Or do they actually do well? Okay. But so let's take that case in which AI or AIs or whatever, some subset of AIs have reached epistemic authority in domains X, Y, and Z, whatever. Does that change anything about either, how companies should continue to develop AI once they're epistemic authorities, how they should talk about them, how companies who are buying from them should think about it, how government should think? What's the sort of upshot or what's the call to action, or what does that change if we get AIs that reach that bar of epistemic authority?
I think it means a bit of a seismic shift at the level of designing architecture and operationalizing AI systems, because these AI systems need to be designed in ways that meet these reevaluation conditions and defeater conditions that might apply to a total evidence view. So they need to allow for the AI's input also to be weighed in certain ways. There need to be assessments or audits possible to actually look inside in order to fulfill and operationalize the kind of account that I'm sketching here for total evidence, AI deference type accounts. So that's what that would mean. And if you think about machine learning applications currently, the way we're building these systems will not by design fulfill those criteria.
So is the idea that what it would mean is that we'd have to take the AI's outputs as evidence, but then thinking through it as a piece of evidence would require us to think about the means by which it came to that conclusion.
Yeah.
Which would in turn require a level of explainability and transparency that we don't have with 99% of AI out there.
It would mean that you need to be able to interpret, to probe, just like I could probe your judgment. So you say we should then defer to the outcome assuming that, and then there goes the list of, we need to be able to check this. And that's, of course, a hard problem that we're wrestling with at the moment. But I think what this kind of discussion turning to social epistemology shows is that we can arrive at some of those insights, the necessity for certain explainability, interpretability techniques, also from social epistemology, not just from ethics. Sometimes there's a kind of ethical argument, which I think is actually problematic. Sometimes we talk about as if transparency is an inherent value. There's some really nice work being done also by philosophers how transparency and expertise are actually in conflict. If you're an authority, if you're an expert, pressing
like CT Nguyen
yeah,
work.
exactly. That's an excellent paper. Just for the listeners, he argues that essentially, experts have access to certain reasons, and they are unique to the expert community. To force them to make them explicit is actually making them lie and twist their words. And this, of course, applies to transparency efforts. Long story short, I think this kind of discussion provides, again, an argument for these kinds of requirements, but again, from the perspective of epistemology.
Yeah. All right, Ben, this was great. Super interesting, fascinating stuff. And you've given me a lot to think about, and I appreciate it. I especially appreciate that I've been thinking a lot about how to categorize risks of AI in ways that my audience could understand, whether they're audience of this podcast or clients or whatever. And I want to, when it comes to hallucinations aren't really ethical risks. So they roll into ethical risks if you do it in sort of high risk context, but they're epistemic risks. They're risks of coming to believe the wrong thing. And I would love for people to start talking about things like ethical risks and epistemic risks. And among the epistemic risks would potentially be, if your view is right, automatically deferring to an AI that's your epistemic authority. That's another epistemic risk that seems like it's likely. It's not. It's actually, I don't want to wrap things up here, but it's like a variety of automation bias.
That's one way to put it. Automation bias can probably take other forms. I was thinking as I was doing some research on this, in a way, yes, preemptionism goes hand in hand with automation bias, but it's not like there's just automation bias. It's just there's a kind of interesting rational argument, if you're concerned about truth, to always go with the one source of truth. Even an AI system and a doctor is not the oracle of Delphi. It's not like they will know in every case. So that's why this kind of argument then kind of reaches its limits.
Thanks, Ben. This was great.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design the podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lange, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasilenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.